The Huns, Asian invaders, or something else? Ancient DNA Answers, a 1,500-year-old question format, faceless, AI voiceover, long form, approximately 20 to 22 minutes. English style, documentary, evidence-driven, no-fluff primary source, Marotti et al., 2022. The Genetic Origin of Huns, Avars, and Conquering Hungarians. Current Biology 32, 2858 to 2870. Supporting Kaiser et al., 2021. Gnecchi Rusconi et al., 2022. Zhong et al., 2020. 00 to 030. Cold open, visual slow push-in on a Roman-era mosaic showing a horseback warrior, cut to a close-up of an artificially deformed elite skull from a Carpathian Basin Hun burial, cut to gold jewelry, a composite bow, the reconstructed profile of a Hunnic elite grave. Narration. In the 5th century of the Common Era, a people appeared on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, and within a single generation brought the western half of it to the brink of collapse. Their leader was Attila. Roman writers described them as short, fierce, foreign, and utterly alien. They rode horses with an expertise that European armies could not match. They shot composite bows with lethal accuracy from the saddle. They deformed the skulls of their children so that, as adults, they would carry the unmistakable silhouette of their people. For more than 1,500 years, historians argued about who these people actually were, where they had come from, and whether the shadow they cast across Eurasia was connected to another shadow that had fallen across Han Dynasty China 400 years earlier. In 2022, ancient DNA finally gave us the first clear answer, and the answer was stranger and more layered than either side of the old debate had predicted. 030 to 215. The Huns appear in Europe. Visual animated map of Eurasia around 370 CE. The Huns appear as red markers crossing the Volga. Arrows push westward, collide with Gothic territory, and cascade. Goths fleeing into the Roman Empire, Roman legions retreating, cities under siege. Narration. The Huns enter the European historical record around the year 370 of the Common Era, when they appear on the steppe north of the Black Sea and begin crushing the Gothic kingdoms there. The first Roman source to mention them is Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier turned historian who wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and horror. He described them as physically short but unbelievably tough, as incapable of settled life, as eating raw meat softened under their saddles, and as fighting in a swirling, unpredictable style that none of Rome's enemies had ever employed. Ammianus, like most Roman observers, had almost certainly never seen a Hun in person. But he was drawing on reports from the frontier, and those reports were panicked. The Gothic collapse was the first domino. When the Huns pushed the Goths westward, Gothic refugees by the hundreds of thousands arrived at the Roman border on the Danube, begging for sanctuary. The Emperor Valens let them cross. Within 2 years, tensions between the refugees and Roman officials exploded into open war, and in 378, the Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. Valens himself died on the field. Historians often point to Adrianople as the beginning of the end of Rome's western half, and the Huns, who had not yet fought a single Roman, were the reason it happened. Over the next 60 years, the Huns consolidated their dominance over the steppe, absorbed or displaced the Alans and Sarmatians, and moved their political center into the Carpathian Basin, the Great Plain in the heart of what is now Hungary. Under Attila, who ruled from about 434 until his death in 453, they dominated a territory stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian. They extracted enormous amounts of gold in tribute from both halves of the Roman Empire. They destroyed cities across the Balkans. They invaded Gaul in 451 and were fought to a standstill at the Catalonian plains by a Roman and Visigothic coalition. The following year, they invaded Italy. Pope Leo I met Attila in person and, through some combination of diplomacy, payment, and perhaps luck, persuaded him to withdraw. A year after that, Attila died. His sons fought over his inheritance. His empire collapsed within a decade. And here is the strange part. For all their impact, the Romans never really understood where the Huns had come from. No one in the Roman world had a clear memory of their homeland. They were, in the Roman imagination, a force that had erupted out of the Eastern darkness, done its work, and vanished again, leaving a transformed continent behind. 3 o'clock to 4:30. Why the origin question mattered. Visual 19th and 20th century historians' portraits and books. Shots of academic journals, contested maps, and handwritten notes in different languages. German, Russian, French, Chinese, Hungarian. Narration. The question of where the Huns came from is not just a curiosity. It sits at the center of several politically charged debates that ran through European scholarship for the past 2 centuries. If the Huns were a fundamentally Asian people, in the sense of being descended from populations of the Eastern Eurasian steppe, then the fall of the Western Roman Empire had a specific external cause. It was, in part, a story of Eurasia as a single system, with climatic and political shocks in Mongolia radiating outward and eventually breaking the Roman frontier. If, on the other hand, the Huns were largely a local phenomenon, a European steppe confederation that had simply consolidated under new leadership, then the fall of Rome looked more like an internal European story, and the connections across Eurasia looked weaker. During the 19th and 20th centuries, these questions also became entangled with nationalism. In Hungary especially, the question of whether the Huns were ancestors of the modern Hungarians had political weight. Some Hungarian intellectuals embraced the Hun connection enthusiastically. Others rejected it. The later Avars and the conquering Magyars of the 9th century were also steppe peoples, and their relationship to the Huns and to each other became its own minefield. The science could not be separated from the politics, and the politics often drove the science. What the field needed was evidence that did not care about either. It needed DNA. 4:30 to 6:30. The Xiongnu hypothesis, visual ancient Chinese chronicles opening on screen, animated map of the Xiongnu Confederation at its peak, Mongolia, northern China, parts of Central Asia, around 200 BCE shots of excavated Xiongnu graves from modern archaeological sites in Mongolia. Narration, running parallel to the Hun story, was another older story from the opposite end of Eurasia. Several hundred years before the Huns appeared in Europe, a powerful nomadic confederation called the Xiongnu had dominated the Mongolian steppe. They were China's great rival during the Han dynasty. Chinese sources describe them in remarkable detail. Their social organization, their burial customs, their military tactics, even the names and lineages of their leaders. The Xiongnu were mounted nomads. They used composite bows. They built their power on a combination of raid, trade, and tribute. Like the later Huns, they deformed the skulls of elite children. Like the later Huns, they buried their highest-ranking dead in elaborate mounded graves filled with gold, horses, and weapons. Around the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Xiongnu Confederation collapsed under a combination of sustained Chinese military pressure and internal succession conflicts. Some Xiongnu groups submitted to Chinese authority and were resettled along the frontier. Others fragmented into smaller groupings, and some, according to Chinese chronicles, migrated westward, vanishing beyond the horizon of East Asian records. Chinese historians lose track of them as they disperse across Central Asia. And then, about 3 centuries later and 5,000 kilometers away, the Huns appear in Europe. The parallels were impossible to ignore. 2 confederations, both dominated by mounted archers, both practicing cranial deformation, both built around elite mounded burials, both hostile to settled agricultural empires on their southern flanks, both using the same basic military technology. And the name Xiongnu, as it was pronounced in Old Chinese, may have sounded something like Hongnu or Xiongno. The Greek and Latin rendering Hunni or Hunoi is close but not identical. For linguists, the phonetic match was tantalizing but not conclusive. For nearly 200 years, the Xiongnu to Hun migration theory went in and out of fashion. Some scholars treated it as obvious and almost certain. Others dismissed it as wishful thinking built on superficial similarities. Eminent historians took sides. The French scholar Joseph de Guignes championed the connection in the 18th century. German and Russian scholars developed it further in the 19th. By the mid-20th century, skepticism had hardened. Otto Manchen-Helfen, whose massive unfinished study of the Huns was published posthumously in 1973, argued that the link was unproven and probably unprovable. The problem was not hostility to the idea. The problem was that historical sources, archaeology, and linguistics could only take the argument so far. The evidence kept running out before the question could be settled. There was one kind of evidence that could, in principle, settle it: But in the 1970s, that evidence did not yet exist as a scientific tool. 630 to 830. The rise of ancient DNA, visual time-lapse of a modern paleogenetics laboratory, shots of skeletal samples being drilled for powder, petrous bones being processed, sequencing machines running, transition to published paper covers, Hawk 2015, Olalde 2018, Margarian 2020, Marodi 2022. Narration, ancient DNA as a scientific discipline really began in the late 1990s and accelerated into the 2010s. For most of that period, the technical challenge was enormous. DNA inside a skeleton degrades. Most ancient bones contain only tiny fragments contaminated with bacteria, fungi, and the DNA of every person who has ever handled the remains. Extracting a clean, trustworthy ancient genome required breakthroughs in sampling technique, especially the discovery around 2014 that the petrous bone inside the inner ear preserved DNA far better than any other part of the skeleton, and it required sequencing technologies that could work with tiny, heavily damaged fragments. By the late 2000s and 10s, these technologies had matured enough that entire populations could be studied. The 2015 papers on the Yamnaya expansion had rewritten our understanding of European prehistory. The 2018 Bell Beaker paper had revealed a near-total population replacement in Britain. The 2020 Viking study had mapped the entire Viking diaspora. The field had a methodology, a growing reference database, and a string of major results behind it. What it did not have by 2020 was a resolution to the Hun question. The gap was not technical, the gap was sampling. The Carpathian Basin, where the Hun political center was located, had relatively few well-excavated and securely dated Hunnic period elite burials available for destructive sampling. The Xiongnu side had been partially addressed by a 2021 paper from a team led by Christine Kaiser, which sequenced genomes from Xiongnu Iron Age burials in Mongolia, but the European side was still largely unsampled for Huns specifically. You could not link what had not yet been mapped. That is what the 2022 study changed. (830 to 1130), the 2022 study, what they did and what they found, visual close-up shots of the specific elite burials used in the study. Artificially deformed skulls, grave goods in situ, reconstructions of the burial context, transition to a map of Hungary with sample locations marked. Narration. In 2022, a team led by Zoltán Marotti at the University of Szeged in Hungary published a study in the journal Current Biology that finally tested the Xiongnu Hun hypothesis directly. The study sequenced DNA from elite burials associated with the European Huns in the Carpathian Basin. It also included burials from two later waves of steppe nomads in the same region, the Avars of the 7th and 8th centuries, and the conquering Hungarians, or Magyars, of the 9th century, and it compared all of these against a large reference panel of ancient and modern Eurasian populations, including the published Xiongnu genomes from Mongolia. The choice of sampling sites was important. The researchers specifically targeted burials that, based on archaeological and anthropological criteria, appeared to represent high-status individuals within the Hun political hierarchy. These were graves with distinctive elite markers, cranial deformation, rich grave goods, Eastern-style weapons, and horse gear. If any set of European burials could reasonably be expected to reflect the genetic makeup of the Hun ruling lineage, it was this set. The results for these elite Hun burials were clear and specific. A significant and consistent component of their ancestry traced directly back to populations of the Eastern Eurasian steppe, with strong genetic affinities to the Xiongnu reference samples from Mongolia. This was not a subtle signal. Several individuals carried so much East Asian ancestry that genetically they would have been indistinguishable from contemporaries buried in Mongolia. Their nearest genetic neighbors in the reference database were Iron Age Xiongnu. Their distance from the contemporary European populations around them was large. Visual simplified PCA style plot. 3 clusters clearly labeled: Xiongnu samples, Hun elite samples, European Iron Age samples. Lines and arrows show how some Hun elite individuals cluster tightly with Xiongnu, others sit partway between clusters, a few sit closer to European populations. Narration. The timing also matched. The 300-year gap between the collapse of the Xiongnu Confederation in Mongolia and the arrival of the Huns on the Pontic steppe was exactly the window in which a mobile population could have crossed the Eurasian landmass, accumulating local admixture in each generation while preserving a core lineage. The study did not claim that every European Hun Hun was a direct unbroken descendant of a Xiongnu migrant. The data ruled that out, as we will see in a moment, but it did establish that the core of the European Hun elite descended through a multi-generational migration across Central Asia, from populations indistinguishable from the Mongolian Xiongnu. The headline was finally confirmed. After 15 centuries of argument, ancient DNA had reached into the Carpathian soil and pulled out a thread that ran continuously all the way back to Mongolia. If the study had stopped there, it would have been an important but relatively simple confirmation. The old hypothesis, broadly speaking, had been right, but the study did not stop there. 1130 to 1400. The complication: Huns were never just one people. Visual animated diagram showing a population moving westward across the steppe, with the color of its genetic composition shifting as it absorbs new groups: Sarmatians, Germans, Slavs. By the time it reaches the Carpathian Basin, the population is visibly heterogeneous. Narration: here is where the 2022 study becomes genuinely important, rather than just confirmatory. The researchers did not only sample individuals with clear East Asian ancestry, they sampled a range of burials associated with the Hunnic period in the Carpathian Basin, including ones that, from their archaeological context alone, looked indistinguishable from the elite graves discussed above. Many of those individuals did not carry strong East Asian ancestry at all. They had intermediate profiles, some East Asian input mixed with Sarmatian, Germanic, and local European ancestry. A few buried with unambiguously Hunnic grave goods in unambiguously Hunnic contexts had no detectable East Asian ancestry whatsoever. They were, genetically speaking, European, but their burials were Hunnic in every archaeological sense. The cranial deformation was there, the weapons were there, the horse gear was there, the position in the cemetery was there. What this reveals is a pattern that historians of the steppe have been describing for decades, but which genetics has now confirmed at the individual burial level. The Hun Confederation that reached Europe was not ethnically uniform. It was a political and military organization that had absorbed populations across Eurasia as it moved. Its ruling lineage was genetically Xiongnu derived. Its armies, its households, its subjects, and even some members of its elite were not. Belonging to the Hun political order did not require being genetically Hun. It required swearing loyalty to the Hun leadership, paying tribute, and, when required, fighting under Hun banners. Visual reconstruction of Attila's court. A visually diverse group, mounted warriors of various ancestries, women, servants, diplomats, a Germanic envoy, and a Chinese-looking steppe noble seated at the same table. Narration: by the time the Huns arrived in the Carpathian Basin in the 420s and 430s, they had already been in sustained contact with Iranian-speaking Sarmatians on the Pontic steppe for at least 2 generations. They had absorbed parts of the Atlantic population. To the north, they had encountered Germanic tribes, many of whom had entered their orbit as tributaries or as integrated military contingents. Further west, they would incorporate Slavs, Goths, Gepids, and others. The 2022 study's European ancestry Huns were not imposters in the burials. They were real Huns. They were just Huns whose grandparents had been something else. Attila's own court reflected this. His closest advisors included Germans and Romans. His diplomats communicated in Latin and Greek. The gold drinking cups archaeologists have found in Hun period graves include both steppe-style and late Roman workmanship. Hunnic identity, by the time it produced Attila, had become less an ancestry and more a political allegiance. This is what I mean when I say the Huns were a franchise. An eastern core with a ruling lineage that traced back to Mongolia had carried itself across 5,000 kilometers and more than 2 centuries, and by the time it set up its capital on the Hungarian plain, it had accumulated so much demographic and cultural baggage that calling it a single people is almost misleading. That too is a finding, maybe the deepest finding the study produced. The old debate had framed the question as a binary. Were the Huns Xiongnu descendants or were they not? The answer turned out to be yes and also no. The ruling lineage was, the Confederation was not, and the Confederation is what actually invaded Europe. (1400 to 1600) cranial deformation and the cultural package. Visual photographs and 3D reconstructions of artificially deformed skulls from Hun, Xiongnu, and Sarmatian contexts. Animations showing how the deformation was produced in infancy with binding. Narration. One of the most recognizable features of the Hun elite was artificial cranial deformation. By binding the skulls of infants, Hunnic families produced adults with unmistakably elongated heads, a mark of status visible from a distance and for the entire life of the individual. The practice is deeply strange to modern eyes, but it had been widespread across Eurasia and even the Americas in various periods. For the Huns, it was a distinguishing feature, so much so that Roman sources comment on it. Here is something useful about cranial deformation. It is a learned cultural practice, not a genetic one. A family can adopt it or abandon it within a single generation, and that means the distribution of deformed skulls in Hun-era burials is a cultural map, not a genetic one. It tells us which communities considered themselves part of the Hun political order, and who their children would grow up to be. Genetic analysis of deformed skull individuals in the 2022 study and in earlier skeletal surveys confirms this. Some deformed skull individuals are genetically close to the Xiongnu, others are genetically European. The skull shape follows the politics, not the ancestry. This matters because Roman sources consistently emphasize the Hunnic look. To a Roman observer, a deformed skull, a short frame, and a distinctively Asian face all signaled Hun, but those three signals did not always travel together. A tall European mercenary who had grown up in a Hunnic household and whose head had been bound as a baby would still look Hunnic to a Roman. A short East Asian individual who had recently married into a Gothic family would not. Ethnographic description in the ancient world was often impressionistic. Modern genetics is now correcting the impression on 1600 to 1800. The later waves, Avars and Magyars, visual map transitioning from the Hunnic Empire around 450 CE to the Avar Khaganate around 650 CE to the Magyar settlement in the Carpathian Basin in 895 CE. Each transition is marked with a wave of steppe arrivals from the east. Narration. The 2022 study also looked at the populations that followed the Huns into the Carpathian Basin, because the Hun story does not end with Attila. Less than a century after the Hun collapse, a new steppe confederation, the Avars, dominated the same region. 2 centuries after the Avar collapse, the conquering Magyars arrived and founded the Hungarian state. All three waves share a basic pattern: an eastern steppe elite imposing itself on a mostly European substrate, and the question of how related they were to each other and to the Xiongnu had never been settled. The Avars the study found also carried significant East Asian ancestry. In fact, the signal in Avar elite burials was, in some ways, even stronger and more uniform than in the Hun elite. A 2022 companion paper from Nechi Ruscone and colleagues working with samples from Avar period Hungary showed that the Avar elite was particularly tightly connected to populations of the northeastern Asian steppe, regions in what is now eastern Mongolia and northeastern China. The genetic distance between an Avar elite individual and a contemporary Carpathian European was enormous. The researchers estimated that the Avar migration had been extraordinarily rapid, crossing Eurasia in perhaps as little as a few decades in the early 7th century, rather than the slower multi-generational trek of the Huns. The conquering Magyars arriving at the end of the 9th century also carried Eastern ancestry, though more diluted. Their language, Hungarian, which belongs to the Uralic family and is not Indo-European, connects them linguistically to populations that at that time lived in the forest zones between the Volga and the Urals. Their genetic profile is consistent with an origin in that region, combined with significant admixture during their westward migration. 3 separate waves, 3 distinct but partially overlapping eastern signals. 1,000 years of steppe migrations funneling again and again into the same Carpathian Basin, and each wave, once settled, progressively blended into the majority European population around it. 1800 to 1930. The modern legacy, visual modern Hungarian streetscapes, faces from different regions of Hungary, overlaid with percentage graphics showing the faint residue of Eastern ancestry in different subpopulations. Cut to a linguist at a desk, reading Hungarian text out loud, with Uralic family cognates appearing on screen. Narration. Modern Hungarians today carry only a small residue of all these Eastern inputs. Across most of the Hungarian population, the genetic contribution from Huns, Avars, and conquering Magyars Magyars combined averages somewhere in the range of a few percent of total ancestry, with slightly higher concentrations in some specific regional groups, particularly among the Shekeli of Transylvania. In the broad sense, modern Hungarians are genetically European, well within the normal range of their neighbors in Slovakia, Austria, and Romania, and yet the language survives. Hungarian, spoken today by more than 13 million people, is one of the most robust linguistic legacies of the steppe migrations into Europe. It is a survivor. The genetic trace of its carriers has almost dissolved, but the language itself is still alive, still taught, still used in government and literature and daily life. That is worth pausing on. The Huns vanished genetically into Europe. The Avars vanished genetically into Europe. But the linguistic tradition that the Magyars brought with them, related to but distinct from what the earlier waves had spoken, held on. Languages can outlive the populations that carry them. Hungarian is the proof. There is a deeper lesson here about how cultural transmission actually works. A language, a cuisine, a legal tradition. These can propagate through channels that do not require the survival of the original population. Conversely, genetic continuity can persist for thousands of years, while language, religion, and custom are overwritten again and again. The Hun story contains both halves of this pattern. Genes moved west, absorbed local populations, and faded. A related tradition, centuries later, planted a language that is still spoken in the same soil. The past does not pass on evenly. It passes on selectively, and the selection is rarely what anyone at the time would have expected. 1930 to 2100, what it all means, and the bigger question, visual sweeping aerial shot of the Eurasian steppe. Grass to the horizon, a single rider in the distance. Overlay a timeline from 200 BCE to 1300 CE with successive steppe confederations highlighted. Xiongnu, Huns, Avars, Turks, Magyars, Mongols. Narration: let me pull back and summarize what the ancient DNA has told us, because the detail can bury the broader picture. The old Xiongnu Hun hypothesis, dismissed for much of the 20th century as speculative, turned out to be substantially correct. The ruling elite of the European Huns did descend through a multi-generational westward migration from populations closely related to the Xiongnu of Mongolia. The timing works. The cultural parallels have a genetic backbone. The ancient sources that hinted at a connection were closer to the truth than the skeptics of the mid-20th century allowed. At the same time, the naive version of the hypothesis that the Huns were simply transplanted Xiongnu, a block of Mongolian steppe nomads who arrived intact in Europe, is clearly false. The Hun Confederation that invaded Europe was a politically cohesive but genetically heterogeneous body. Its elite carried an Eastern signal. Its armies and households did not, or did so only partially. The Confederation was a franchise, not a migration. And zoom out further. The Xiongnu, the Huns, the Avars, the Turks, the Magyars, the Mongols. Wave after wave of steppe confederations rolled westward for more than 1,000 years. Each time a political tradition and a set of military technologies would consolidate somewhere on the eastern steppe, then spill west, absorbing or displacing the populations in its path. Each wave left a genetic signal that progressively diluted in the generations after settlement. And each wave was only partly caused by the conditions historians traditionally emphasized. Political crises with China, internal succession wars, charismatic leadership. The rest of the cause appears to be climate. Paleoclimate data from the Mongolian plateau shows that many of these expansions correlate with periods of sustained drought or cold on the steppe. When the grass failed, the riders moved. And when the riders moved, civilizations at the far end of Eurasia felt it centuries later. The Huns, in that sense, were one data point in a much larger pattern. The collapse of Rome's western half was not only a Roman story, it was a story that began in Mongolia. 2100 to 2200, cliffhanger and CTA visual. A weathered, artificially deformed Hunnic skull in museum lighting. Slow push-in on the eye socket. Hard cut to a modern wide shot of the Hungarian plain at dawn, the Danube visible in the distance. Narration: the 2022 study answered the oldest question about the Huns, but it opened 3 new ones. Why did the Mongolian steppe produce this pattern so reliably for more than 1,000 years? Xiongnu, Huns, Avars, Turks, Mongols, one after another, all pushing the same direction. What role did climate really play, and can we now actually line up the paleoclimate data with the expansion dates? And what happened to the Huns' closest modern genetic relatives, the populations in Central Asia whose ancestors stayed put while the Huns rode west? All of these are questions I plan to address in their own dedicated episodes. If you want to see what the last 30 years of paleoclimate research has to say about why the steppe kept erupting, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next video in this series. If you have a specific steppe empire you want me to cover in depth, the Xiongnu, the Avars, the Gokturks, the Mongols, tell me in the comments. I read every comment and the request list is how I decide what to produce next. And if this episode taught you something you did not know before, leave a thumbs up. It helps the channel reach other people who care about evidence-based history. Until next time. End of script. Schurzorchens. For fact-checking Maroti, Z et al. 2022. The genetic origin of Huns, Avars, and conquering Hungarians. Current biology, 32 2858 to 2870. Primary source for this video, Kaiser, C et al. In 2021. Genetic evidence suggests a sense of family, parity, and conquest in the Xiongnu Iron Age nomads of Mongolia. Human genetics, 140, 349 to 359. Necki Ruscone, G. A. et al. 2022. Ancient genomes reveal origin and rapid trans-Eurasian migration of 7th century Avar elites. Cell 185, 1402 to 1413, Zhang C. et al. Or 2020, a dynamic 6,000-year genetic history of Eurasia's eastern steppe. Cell 183, 890 to 904, Neporosky, E. et al. 2019. We chromosome haplogroups from Hun, Avar, and conquering Hungarian period nomadic people of the Carpathian Basin. Scientific reports, 16,569. Kim, H.J., 2013. The Huns, Rome, and the Birth of Europe. Cambridge University Press. Historical context, not genetics. Use for dates and narrative verification. Ammianus Marcellinus, Res Gestae, Book 31. The earliest detailed Roman account of the Huns. Männchen Helfen, O. 1973. The World of the Huns, 20th century standard reference now partially superseded but still valuable for archaeology and philology. Production notes, runtime estimate. The narration is approximately 5,000 words, at a natural documentary pace of 145 to 160 words per minute, with natural pauses and emphasis. This produces a video in the 20 to 22 minute range. If you want to hit exactly 20 minutes, trim sections 1400 to 1600 and 1600 to 1800 lightly. 11 Lab settings recommendation. For a documentary tone, use a male voice with gravitas. Adam, Antoni, or one of the premium custom voices. Stability 45, similarity 75, style 15. Insert SSML pauses of 0.8 seconds between paragraphs and 0.4 seconds before key factual statements, particularly in the sections introducing the 2022 study and the complication it created, visual density. The script has roughly 18 visual cues across 22 minutes, or one significant visual change every 70 to 80 seconds. For retention on long-form documentary content, you want to aim for a visual change or meaningful movement every 15 to 20 seconds on top of that. Plan for zoom-ins, pans, and overlay graphics between the major cues. Map graphics. The three most important visuals in the video are the 370 CE map of the Hun arrival, the simplified PCA plot of Hun-Xiongnu European clustering, and the multi-wave map showing Huns, Avars, and Magyars arriving in the Carpathian Basin. These are the shots that do the most persuasive work in the video. Invest in them. Do not use screenshots from the original papers. Redraw for clarity, consistency, and your channel's visual brand. Thumbnail suggestion: combined image of a deformed elite Hun skull on the left and a map of Eurasia with a red arrow from Mongolia to Hungary on the right. Large text: DNA solves the Huns. High contrast, warm color grade. This style consistently outperforms portrait thumbnails in the ancient DNA niche. End.